Hello, everyone. I am Ferris Wabe, and good afternoon. Welcome to this session of the Contemporary Artist Book Conference, Breaking Protocol. My name is Ferris Wabe. I am a Arab man, medium-length hair, white glasses. I'm a member of the organizing committee of the conference and will act as a host for this session. CABC has been held since 2008, and this year is organized by the Center for Book Arts in conjunction with Printed Matter's New York Art Book Fair. We'd like to thank our conference sponsors, the Broken Rail, Sorted Library, the San Francisco Center for the Book, and Stephen Burry. Center for Book Arts and the usual in-person space at the Contemporary Artist Book Conference are in the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging and uplifting the Munsee Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations and the lands in which you're tuning in from. There are 5 sessions overall between Friday and Saturday, which have been exploring a wide range of questions about artist books visibility, what is now and what it can be. A link to the full CABC program will be posted in the chat window. These sessions are being live streamed on YouTube and CABC's page on Center for Book Arts website. Recordings will also be posted on the Center's website after the conference. If you have questions during the session, we hope you will please post them in the chat. And as hosts, we'll be asking them on your behalf to the panelists and the panelists themselves. Attendees will be muted throughout, and we recommend that you also keep the cameras turned off. Please feel free to use the chat throughout the session to communicate with your fellow attendees, the presenters, and myself. We'll be posting relevant links during the talks as well. So I'd like to start by introing our presenters. Rael Christian is a writer, editor, and art historian based in Queens, New York. Her work explores issues related to identities, diasporas, media, and materiality. Her writing has appeared in Bomb Magazine, The Broken Rail, Art in America, and Art Papers, where she is a contributing editor. Her essays have been featured in catalogs published by Q Art Foundation, DC Moore Gallery, the Hunter College Art Gallery, Sekunda Jenkins and Company, and Performa. Recently, she curated the exhibition Stephen Anthony Johnson II, Getting Blood from Stone at ISCP. She also curated the Earth Leaked Red Ochre at Miriam Gallery and edited the accompanying catalog. Christian is the Assistant Director of Editorial Initiatives at the Vera List Center for Arts and Politics at the New School. She received her MA in Art History from Hunter College and her bachelor's degree from New York University in Art History, Media, Culture, and Communication. Maria Hupfield, she, her, is a Toronto-based artist and transdisciplinary maker working with industrial felt at the intersection of performance, art, design, and sculpture. She is the inaugural Artworks TO Legacy Artist in Residency with the City of Toronto, Ravines, and a Mellon Fellow, Center for the Imagination in the Borderlands, Arizona State University, USA, 2022. A recipient of the Hamatsin Mid-Career Award for Outstanding Achievement in Canada in 2018, she has exhibited extensively, including recent projects at Art Gallery of Ontario, National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, and in New York at CARA, Center for Art Research and Alliance, the Abrams Art Center, the New York Museum of Art and Design, amongst others. An assistant professor and Canadian Research Chair, Transdisciplinary Indigenous Arts at the University of Toronto, Hupfield is a Martin Clan and an urban off-res member of the Anishinaabek Nation belonging to the Wildsaxing First Nation in Ontario, Canada. So I'm gonna give it to Maria and Rael. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferris. My name is Rael Christian. As Ferris mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director of Editorial Initiatives at the Vera List Center. I'm a Black woman. I have short, jaw-length black locks. I'm wearing a white button-down shirt. I'm sitting in front of a low bookcase, and I have a white wall behind me.
Thank you, Rael. I'm Maria Hupfield. I'm a light-skinned Native woman. I'm sitting in my studio. You can see some felt behind me and some bookcases. A visually busy space. I'm wearing a gray turtleneck and have a necklace on with some tin jingles. My hair's down.
Well, I'm excited to be in conversation with you, Maria, about your forthcoming artist book as part of your fellowship with the Vera List Center, the Borderlands Fellowship, which, as Ferris mentioned, is a joint initiative by the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at Arizona State University and the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, that looks at different ways of imagining borderlands, imagining space that connects disparate geographies and identities, and sort of undermines this idea of the local, and or complicates this idea of the local and national or international boundaries. And so you're sort of in that tradition. You're currently in Toronto, and I'm in, or Toronto, as you'd say, and I'm in New York. And so, yeah, in speaking about this book today and in organizing this conversation, we are taking the idea of visibility of artist books to a more conceptual place, and thinking about ways of the ways in which identity is transcribed into print, into books, ways that identity can be trapped or held within an archive, but also ways of moving beyond that, ways of enacting opacity, denying a kind of intentional denial of legibility, or of an explicit definition of the self, of yeah, ways of making a living archive that we've talked about. So I guess to begin, maybe we can just talk about the origins of the Breaking Protocol project.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the first things, it's so good to see you today. You're looking good, mighty fine over there, as always. I wish, I miss you. I wish I could be there in person. And hello to everyone else who's watching and who may be watching online in the future. Wow. So when I started this fellowship, initially, I guess I was living in Brooklyn for 9 years. And then right before the pandemic, I returned back to Toronto to teach at the University of Toronto in Mississauga. And our treaty partners there are, my relatives, the Anishinaabek, but from the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, which makes things very simple for us in terms of, they have an office on campus and all of that. But in returning home, there's so much that's been happening. But overall, so thinking about this conference, I was reviewing what was going on. It looks incredible. And one of the things that stood out for me was the title of it's about invisibility. And there's a lot of talk about how do we reinvent the publication in this moment in time, as we're looking at who has access to it, a lot of content moving to other formats, whether it's digital media or publications. And I was realizing as I was teaching a lot of courses, as a performance artist myself, that there just wasn't a lot of resources out there. So in terms of invisibility of publication, I felt like there's a invisibility and not even a presence of Indigenous performance art because it was such a young history, young in the sort of Western art world sense, because in actuality, if you were to ask a senior established artist like Rebecca Belmore, she would say that's been going on a lot longer, right to the point when Native people were taken overseas as spectacle, that if they decided to piss on the street, that was a sort of performance as well of sorts. So anyway, all of that to say that really fueled things. So when you're asking about the origins of or the inception of our book project that we're working on together. And I have to say, it really is something we're working on together because as a visual artist, this is my first book project. Of course, I've worked on other publications, catalogs, but not book projects. So really thinking, how do I move from, as an artist who does performance, not only now thinking, how to move in a gallery, how to work in, as a body in a space that's codified. But then what does that look like when you take a tradition of making that, of course, is rooted in art history and all of this, radicalism of performance art history, but also that is grounded in an oral tradition, in my case, the Anishinaabek Nation, but many different nations and different relations to the practice, culture, each other. So anyway, I just wanted to address that I felt like I was in a void of what was there.
One thing I love about this book is that it's very unique as an artist book in that it's not only your voice, it's the voice of many of your frequent collaborators, all of whom are Indigenous performance artists. And you're also taking this, we're taking this idea of performance and sort of expanding it beyond what we would maybe traditionally see in a gallery or a museum. And this, it includes people working in digital spaces. It includes stand-up comedians, dancers, other, musicians. And then you're also kind of working between these different realms of performance and thinking about ways that spaces can be activated through sound and just the simple act of being together. And so right now we're working on your introduction, and I really like how you sort of foreground the inception of the book in this longer tradition of performance art, but also looking at how you were feeling at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 as a performance artist who was no longer able to work in the traditional modes that you would work in, but also feelings of isolation that many of us experienced, and how the project became a way of continuing to have collaboration and reciprocity with the other artists that you're constantly in community with. And so I'd love to hear if you could maybe speak about how those conversations came together and how they sort of built.
Absolutely. So maybe this is a good moment to bring up the slideshow. We can show some images.
Yeah.
And I think we have some content there as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you pull that up.
Okay.
All right, here we are. Woohoo! So the title of our talk today really, we're borrowing from the fellowship that I had at Vera List, which they're entering their year of protocol. And so the project I had proposed had a very different nature because then the pandemic came up, right? So let's move on to the next slide. So there I am, getting ready to enter into this incredible, thinking about my body being in the gallery. At that time, I was putting together a protocol handbook as a living document that I would share with, I'd consulted and talked with a lot of other Indigenous academics and media scholars and all kinds of people. And we had put, basically with my research team at the university, we put together this protocol handbook to help them guide and feel stable and secure around navigating Indigenous content at the Indigenous Creation Studio, which is the research space I operate and lead on campus. And so the idea was I was going to take that into a physical space in the gallery and start to imagine what that looked like. But then when the pandemic hit, so let's move ahead to the next slide, that really changed things. And so with the support of Vera List, I started to focus on this idea of having a series of Zoom sessions with other, living in New York, I had a lot of access to performance artists, and we would gather all the time, perform together, just so many people, so many artists. It naturally happened. All kinds of stuff was happening. It was a really exciting moment to be in New York. And finding myself back in Toronto, I realized that was not the case with there's a vibrant performance art scene here, but not with Indigenous performance artists. And as I made a list of who was out there, there's so many people. So, as we were nearing this Zoom fatigue, this height of Zoom, I thought, I'd like to host, if you're asking me, to do whatever I want. I'm like, I want to have a series of Zoom sessions just for performance artists, and we're going to call it coffee break. So we get a break from this, always having to produce content, right? As we shifted from our bodies, this physical presence in the gallery to suddenly being stationary at home in our domestic spaces, and take a moment to really work from trust, and think about being living beings and connecting, and just have this moment for ourselves. And so those sessions, which you had mentioned earlier, the structure of that, here I say there's about 36 artists. We had 6 sessions, and it really came out of my own practice and my own way of working. I often collaborate in performances. So I went to who are the artists I know who are, really, really up there, established artists who I could contact. So I went straight to Rebecca Belmore, to Laurie Blondeau. And I said, who would you like to be in a room with and just have a conversation? So it went very, very natural. It was based on this idea of, it was very social, social networks. So people who we're comfortable with and have a rapport with, who we knew in person, and just bring that to the Zoom space. And so it was a very unstructured kind of space, and also very exciting and very rewarding, and each space was quite different. So that's what happened for the coffee break. And then after those sessions happened, we paid them a fee, and it was just really a great connection to have. I thought, well, what can we do now? And Vera List had offered, you had been hired, and they said, how do you feel about a publication? And I said, I would love to do that. And what I'd like to do is open this up to the artists and offer the invitation to submit something that could get published together. And in that way, it puts it back to them so we can present ourselves in our own terms. So what you're looking at here, this list is a list of the people who are confirmed to participate in the book. There are many more. The coffee break sessions, similar to the publication, are not exhaustive. There's many, many more. So this is only a taste. And it's meant to really shake things up and show that range of scope and be quite exciting. And one of my initial ideas was that, I thought almost we could talk about this more with everyone, but I was like, it's like a zine for performance artists, and just wanting to see what people would present or put forth. And everyone came forward with vastly different things, and it's been quite a time, right, Riel?
Yeah.
So we can go on to you can return to this, but let's move on to the next slide.
And then maybe just for context, so this book is part of, as you mentioned, part of this 2-year Borderlands Fellowship that was structured around the Vera List Center's biennial focus theme, As for Protocols, which looks at protocols as systems of language that determine the ways that we sort of interact with each other, interact with institutions, with our built environments, with our ecological environments. And so your project is, and I think sort of at the heart of the As for Protocols theme is this idea that protocols can be broken and rewritten and restructured to be more equitable. And I like that in the fellowship, or sort of leading into your fellowship. And I think in 2017, you were in conversation with Leanne Betasomasek. Come on. Simpson. And that you spoke about how you don't like the word protocols, and that practices is a better sort of stand-in because it implies collaboration, and that's at the again at the core of your practice, and of course why your artist book would not feature only your work, but the work of many people, a multiplicity of people, of nations coming together.
Yeah, so I think that one of the, we talked about the nature of the book, being just one individual artist. I didn't want to speak for all of Indigenous performance art as an expert, that would require a whole editorial group of people and a lot of thinking and thought and process around that. But what I can do is speak to my own practice and the way, and the experience I've had, in these different performance art gatherings, and moving away from this idea of a scarcity model where Native performance artists are put in competition with one another, right? Like, who's going to be the Native woman for this, or who's going to be the, if Rebecca can't do it, then maybe Cheryl could do it. And then if Cheryl couldn't do it, then maybe they'd ask Archer. And if Archer couldn't do it, then maybe it work its way down to, and then Maria will do it, right? So it's like, but for me, I'm like, we're all here. There's this moment we all have something to say, and it's quite exciting and charged. And I felt like this could reflect that. This felt like a really good opportunity. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. Yeah. And how the coffee break could be a moment similar to the spirit of the coffee break sessions, that was a moment of checking in and saying, I see you, I recognize you, and just really putting that task forward with, let's open up all those different ways that we can represent these many rich practices together. And I think as a performance artist and thinking about the everyday, this idea of the everydayness of a coffee break, of a book, coming into, having that on a coffee table or a bookshelf, really felt like a nice way to insert our narratives and our practices into all these other libraries and resources as a reference and a starting point, so that hopefully it will open up many other possibilities and other types of publications and just spark something. But also be the type of book that you could pick it up and you're like, who's here today? And then you look and you're like, oh my gosh, what is this? What's going on? And then, carry on and really be fed by that.
Yeah. So you have this quote on the screen. I think that comes out of your introduction.
That's right. Yeah, the in-process introduction. I think it's finalized, but yeah, this was something to really speak to the way that that when you have such diversity and range and scope, like, how do you define performance art, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I've heard Esther Neff talk about that as like, it's the pulse of living, right? Like, so it's to define something that in a sense is indefinable. And then thinking about, well, art becomes a space that the protocol, and thinking about this protocol, breaking of a protocol or a protocol break, that there's, each individual artist has different relationship to their nation, to community, to cultural knowledge, to performance, how they entered into it. And I think this publication or this book project reflects that. So, we are seeing someone like Ursula Johnson, who comes from theater and then comes into it that way. So we're really seeing quite a different scope. And for myself, I have never been a dancer or formally trained, but I did a lot of, I feel like for me, performance is really about wanting to, be in my body, and things like sound like this help me be mindful of my movements and my own consciousness. It gets me out of my head, right? And so across that, there isn't one way to define it, but I think it'll really spark the freedom and the scope that art affords to artists working in performance right now, who are, whether it's First Nations, Native American, Pacific Islander, like really looking across all those quite vast territory and scope, and really working on getting some of that language down to begin to talk about that. I think we can, let's look at the next slide. I feel like I'm talking very fast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so seeing Skeena Reese's work here, and kind of a glimpse, a teaser of what her contribution will be in the book, we can talk about the prompt that you gave to each of the artists in the book, and sort of how we framed the invitation to contribute, what we asked for, what we didn't ask for, and then also maybe what your, or I'll just leave it at that. I have another follow-up question, but
Okay, sure. Yeah, it was super open. So for today's presentation, I reached out to a few individuals to get the permission to use the image for this presentation. And one of those is Skeena Reese. Known her for a very long time. She's incredible. We felt for Skeena, her practice is so diverse. And even for her coffee break session, the focus of that, the artists who are involved were really looking at this idea of being a parent, as a young mother, and thinking about the logistics of that and how that's impacted them in their practice. So it was really supportive, and had a very different dynamic than some of the other sessions. So when we talked about what the work might be, what we liked was including some of the work that she's been doing on TikTok, where she has a persona called Victim Princess Mother, to just show this range of another medium that we're seeing introduced in performance art. And I believe it's Ariola who actually brought up, from Vera List, the curator, who brought up, I've been seeing this on TikTok. How exciting is this? And I was like, yes. And so in some instances, for example, Skeena, she's so busy with her day-to-day. When it came down to the work, we actually talked back and forth, and she wasn't sure what she wanted to put in, because usually the ask for a publication is very specific, like, give me this image and the title, right? And then the rest is taken care of. But in this case, it's like so open-ended. But we ended up specifically doing an ask for this work because it really rounded out a lot of the other work. And she has a vast practice. She's easy, there's a lot of resources on her. She's published. So it's just a taste that then points to the richness of her career. Right. And then whereas someone like Rebecca Balmore, it was such a great session. At the end of the session that we did with her on Zoom, she said, it's so fun. It was the best Zoom she had been in. She was quoting like the late James Luna, she was dropping all kinds of incredible knowledge in that short amount of time, because each session was only an hour. We weren't asking for people to like overtax their time. So for her, there were a number of projects she had up. She had that beautiful piece at the Whitney. And then as time was proceeding, we went for something a bit fresher, because she's shown at the Venice Biennale representing Canada, which is well documented. I thought I wanted to show the international scope of her reach as a Anishinaabe woman and performance artist from Canada. And so we went back and highlighted a performance that she did recently, again in Venice, that she returned to. And in this instance, so the performance was called The Sound of the Color Field. Given the level of her stature, someone like Rebecca is so busy. She's like, well, I'm waiting for your publication. I want to support you. But we worked with a curator who she has a very good relationship with, an ongoing history. So another Anishinaabe arts professional. We reached out to Wanda Nanabush, and Wanda included, because she had curated that event and there's a number of other things around that. So she was in the best situation to really bring together a slice of that, which would comprise Rebecca's contribution for the publication. So things really range in this publication. And I'm hoping that in doing that, it shows a range of relationships that performance artists have with curators, the nature of those relationships, but also different formats, right? Like how do we show a performance in book format, right? Do we show a sequence of stills? You think of someone like Chris Burden, where it's a photo, right? The performance is reduced to a photo. So thinking are we looking for the seminal photo? And some artists like Laurie Blondeau work that way. She definitely is always thinking of the visual composition. Her early work was very photo-based. And so she'll often take photos of herself to help her visualize herself before she does a performance. But that's not the case with everyone. So each of these contributions my hope is that they're giving a bit of insight into very different processes and how to represent those in different ways in the book form.
Yeah. And coming back to this question of how to translate performance into book form, it's and then another central question in the book is how do we avoid the pitfalls and of the archive as a static object? And it's interesting to kind of compare these two questions, and in terms of thinking about performance art and the way that it's documented, how the liveliness, the embodied stories that are being told through performance are as you said, reduced down to an image. And in a similar way that archives are a place where myriad histories are reduced to single objects, often stripped of context and feeling. But then also going back to this idea of visibility, and as Megan Liberty spoke about in her session, there's this huge issue of invisibility or lack of transparency when it comes to archives. And so I'm curious to know what the process is of making visible performance as an artist yourself, but also in working with different performance artists as a curator and an editor.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that come up. One is that it has it's pretty recent that when you see a Native artist that were not being historicized or seen in the past. So some of the strategies are things I often talk about this with my husband, Jason Lujan, who's an artist. We collaborate together as well. And with the work that we do, we're often thinking about how we want to be seen and position things and the different, experiences we've had. So one of the things when I perform, he's often paying attention to documentation, like what was the experience like, right? In the photo, I think there's a few things. So wanting to see, I think this is generally with performance, like I want it to look dynamic, charged, something's happening. I like it to see people in relation with other bodies. It's nice to see that there's a crowd, that there's interest shown. So there's a few things I'm thinking of. What I love about this photo of Belmore's work is, something going on. They're wearing construction worker, vests, but they're not construction workers, right? So, there's a lot how an image functions in a document, in a publication or a document is very different than the experience of it. So how can we convey that and carry that over? If we go to the next slide, I think the next slide is the project I did at the end of my residency, which was at the end of the pandemic. I ended up creating a performance art band called Jane Schoolcraft. And the event under which we performed was Super Massive Thunder Boom Ultimate Collection, right? Like I just knew I wanted to get people together, and I wanted to sing. And I made these incredible, crazy jingle pants, and I invited OXDX to design this t-shirt logo, and we got it there. We had these hand drums, and we sang these songs, and I also invited other people to perform as well. So there's a group in Montreal, the Dime Collective, they came, and the amazing Dennis Red Moon Darkeen, who's based out of the Bronx, he came and did an incredible performance as well. And this was all time to kind of be at the end of my fellowship. And it was the day after the day of acknowledging the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and gender inclusive. But I didn't want to perform on the day of, but the day after, to just really show our strength and that we're still kicking ass, right? So this will appear in the book, but what I've done is it's really hard to, how do you capture all of that in a book? So that's part of, one of those questions we're putting forth. And my strategy in this instance was to approach 4 audience members and ask them to write about their experience. And so we're going to get 4 different views of one event, right? And maybe we'll decide, you and I were, figuring out which photos or how many will suffice to really capture that. And some of the artists who are contributing, it might be like I think Charlene Vickers has a score for a performance she did when she was visiting New York. So there's a whole set of tools that are available for artists that have historically been used, whether it's a score, photo documentation, a curator writing a short piece, a contextual label. So it's a question of what information gets included and how do we really round out that performance? What if there's music, how do we, is there a lyric, are there lyrics that are important that need to be included or not? Or does it need to be a transcription, or a script? So I love presenting that to the other artists and seeing what they come up with. And I feel like I'll want to, with this, I'm like, oh, I'm going to need to follow this up. I don't know. I feel like it's just a taste of what we can begin to explore.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's the last slide.
Yeah, if I can stop sharing, I can bring it back up if we want to go back to any of the images. But yeah, I'm curious to know more about this ways that the ways that you built or that you sort of kept in community with people during the pandemic, and ways of building and expanding this idea of digital reciprocity while also thinking about archives yourself.
Yeah, I don't feel like I did a very good job of that. That's part of it. That's why those sessions are like everyone. I was just like, I don't want to be, yeah. Social media is so bad for that it's like this. Okay, now I know what Riel's up to, right? Great job curating that show. So I really do try, and I think the art world, as we know, is based on person-to-person connections, interpersonal exchange. And as a performance artist, I just felt really demoralized during the I can say that now during the pandemic, that events that were being canceled. I mean, I'm sure musicians were feeling the same, theater folks, when you don't have a live audience, you can't, it's going to be harmful to your health to put yourself in that position. And it was all turning into just digital form, like as we are now. So really wanting to feel that energy of the audience and how that contributes to a performance. so yeah, how I was keeping in touch with people, this was one of the ways that I was doing it. Just realizing that usually I would see at events, this often happened in New York. There are people I only see at openings, but there was enough to kind of connect. I think that happened a lot in the Native community in New York, that there's an opening, that's when you saw each other. So you'd go out, at least historically, that was the case. Like art became a center for a lot of things. Or an occasion for gathering. That's how I met my husband, was at an art opening. So without those openings, there wasn't a connection. It was just like, how are you doing? And it was just so good to see someone, and realizing that in New York, that happened a lot, but wasn't necessarily happening to happen in that same way. Basically because North America is so huge, the landmass is so huge, and then the artists are just sprinkled over it. So we didn't really get to see each other too often, even before. But then once the pandemic hit, you only saw each other through, through a monitor. So, so I wasn't doing such a good job of it, and even with my own family. So this was one of my ways. And I think that perhaps for me, that speaks for my practice as well, that I do that, that my practice is so connected. As I'm realizing now, it is a way for me to self-regulate, for myself. And I didn't realize how much it was connected to my own wellness, or how much I depended on it for my own emotional well-being at that time. So it's been a huge learning moment, and to come out of that and to now think, knowing that, where do I go with it? But I'll also share, it was during the coffee break sessions that really, a lot of people shared projects they were working on. So I can say this now, but in the session where Archer Pachowis was a part of, he revealed, some of us stayed on after, and he revealed he was applying for a job at York University. And part of his application was to put together a publication on Native performance art, like a whole edited kind of book. So he is there doing some of that work. So that changed the nature of this publication for me, because I knew that I could depend on the way I work already, which is bringing people together, and in this gesture, because it's something that I felt like this is something I would love to see in the world.
And I also just want to remind people, anyone out there, I can't see who's in attendance, but to feel free to ask questions for Maria, for myself, about the book. I've been thinking about what you mentioned earlier about oral tradition, and I think that this book will ultimately be something that people just kind of have to sit with and learn from, and sort of learn to navigate as they experience it, which is like the beauty of an artist book, that it's not so in your face. It's something that really requires a kind of slow looking and a patience, and maybe that relates to this idea of visibility and identity that you and I have talked about in terms of our collaboration on this book. So I think it's been interesting for me in working alongside you with all of these artists to see what aspects of indigeneity, of nations that they decide to include in the book to make visible, and which ones are sort of more maybe a little bit more opaque, or at least to me, but also the coffee breaks themselves. you may have mentioned that they were closed sessions. They were really only, you were all in community with each other, and that this is a book that came out of those conversations, but we don't know what those conversations were. So it's a really interesting kind of self-organizing that happened there.
Yeah, that was for us. I think it served a purpose. And then now that was like a private facing event that kind of initiated this publication, and this publication is a public facing project, right? And I think that it serves in a lot of different ways, because it's also helping with the career development, showing a level of professional standards, and introducing to some people that's a question, like, how many Native or Indigenous performance artists can you name, right? First question. And I can think, it's it breaks my heart every time to realize, like, James Luna was only included at the Whitney after his death, right? And that was one piece, and in his own country, and to have known him throughout his career. It's so, this isn't about tears, but just a reflection of the reality of just trying to break in there. So I feel that this publication, and why I'm all in with Vera List and with you, is because coming out of New York, this publication is showing these practices are on par. And as an anti-colonial publication that we're pushing for, it's going to introduce, some of these artists, people won't know who they are potentially. And it's going to introduce this whole other level of excellence and ideas. I feel so charged around it. Even the discussions we're having and thinking about what that looks like, and something you can hold. And for me also, like, that we can be alongside each other, and it can spark other things and inform perhaps future projects for the artists, like how they're thinking about how they want their work to be seen. And when they look at it, so it's a resource for the community, but also for art outside of the, for everyone. I feel like it. And the other thing for me is, I also thought, well, I could have done a similar publication for Brooklyn performance artists who I know, so I felt that too, but I wanted to do something that could work, it's a model that then I could think, well, that makes anyone who's involved, they feel really good about it, right? So those are some of my goals. And that it's a big question to think about how each artist places, and wanting to have transparency around their connection to community, how they place it in a particular work without having to over prescribe that or determine that. We're in the arts, in the visual arts, we know how to do that. It's a sophisticated audience that can, when we're reading books, we know how to do that. And putting that in the hands of those artists to determine how they want to be seen, and that we can show a range of those ways, right?
Yeah. So it's not about giving agency, but just ensuring that it's kept untouched by, I think that's important in the way that we work as a center, having always ensuring that the institutional voice is not the most present, not foregrounded.
Yeah. So in some ways, I'm a sort of buffer, right? And I think that that's the difference between having an Indigenous-led project, so that there's an accountability, communication that I have, and responsibility that I have because of the knowledge I know, to present the artist in the best light possible, having curated exhibitions and created catalogs, those are things I've had to do in those ways, those other forms. And then now thinking about carrying that over into an art book, right? Yeah. And so you're absolutely right that as an artist, we can have our own ideas about things, but when you hit, depending on who's telling your story, like who's editing or who, does it become an institutional voice? All those layers that have to be navigated, and wanting to, for me, just bring it back to the artist and see what their interest is, right? Give them that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, we'll see if people read it and then they're like, well, Maria, had I known, I would have, wanted to, I would have done it this way instead, right? Yeah. And I really hope that's the case, because then I can say, do it, right? Go do it.
Yeah.
That could be the best outcome.
It's a living archive. It'll continue to, grow and
have a moment.
Yeah. It's like Ferris has a question for us.
I do. That was so wonderful, you guys. I mean, I think it's fascinating. Documenting, archiving performance art it's very difficult. It can be very difficult, but it can also be very organic. And I'm wondering, when during the process of your fellowship did you decide to do a book? Was it before the Zoom? How did that evolve as part of your project? At what point was it did you decide to do a book? I know you talked about your Zoom copy breaks. Was that kind of a part of the discussions, or did that come after or before, or was it always in the back of your mind? That's my first question. The second question is what did you learn from trying to make a book out of performance art? Was the book format something that was a difficult one to wrap your head around, or did it help you think about it in book format? You know what I mean? Are there limitations, or did the limitations help and work through it? So I guess, and aside from the book, how else would you publish this? You mentioned digital reciprocity, which I love that term, by the way. How do you see it potentially expanding, or outside of the book potentially?
Wow, so many questions. Well, okay, the first question, that's pretty easy. It it wasn't, I didn't know. So I did the Zoom. It really was on it really evolved. So the Zoom session really was its own thing. And I think it was a tail end of that. Maybe they had ended when we talked about a publication. I'd have to look at the timeline. And that's when we were like, there's these artists who are here, right? Because when they came into the Zoom session, I think we're playing with this idea of a publication, but the Zoom session wasn't, I'm going to publish a book based on this. So think about, that wasn't it at all. It really was just as a social gathering, in a visit. And I think even that prompt, when I extended it, was bring a cup of coffee, right? Let's see each other in our homes, right? What are you wearing? What are you gonna wear? Will you be performing while you talk? It was really exciting to see what they would step forward with on that occasion. So it kind of evolved that way. And then even the invitation, I'd have to go back and take a look. I mean, Riel, you probably have that handy, but what that invitation was for the publication, I think was very in an open kind of way, because I wanted people, I was curious to see what they thought and what they were interested in, and so some artists like Tanya Lauken-Linklater has published a book and writes a lot about her practice. So she was like, here, yes, I'd love to. I want to do this. And then she was like, here you go. Here's my question, right? So some people were very clear because, but that wasn't the case with everyone. So it was a kind of case-by-case discussion. And then now I'm forgetting your other question.
The other question was the format of the book. Did it help you as a envelope or frame to think of it that way, or did you find the book format as a limitation, and especially in terms of like its format, but it's also its visibility. Like you're saying, in translation, you could potentially lose some things from performance because it's an embodied practice. So did it help? Did it push the envelope, or how did you wrap your heads around the format as a book?
Yeah. I think that's something Riel and I had conversations around, including looking at other publications on performance art. So I really leaned on Riel for that, and Riel's expertise around book publications. And, that was super exciting. I remember even when I visited, we were making outings to a bookstore to look at things together, which was really fun and rewarding. So that's been an exciting part of the process. But I will share, for me, on my side of things, what helped a lot was the fact that I had just curated a show called The First Water is the Body in New Jersey. And the title of that show is taken from the title of a poem by Natalie Diaz, and the whole exhibition was on water. And so for the catalog, I was like, how do I now put in the catalog, represent the works? And Natalie generously granted us permission to republish the poem, and it was interspersed with images from the exhibition, not to illustrate the poem, but as a reflection to speak to the poem. And so we had one piece by Kelly Spitzer where she had photos of her community, her queer Indigenous community, that were these incredible Black and white photos. And then they also had audio tracks, or there was one that had it was from a series, but we just showed one, and there was an audio track, and the person who was in the image was singing a song. So then we had to go back to Kaylee, who went back to the person in the portrait to get permission if we could transcribe the song. So it became to describe the song, transcribe the song. So what was the gallery experience for each piece to help people so that wasn't performance, but helped me in thinking about this, going that next step. And then for future projects or other projects I'm working on, I am working on a digital living archive project as part of my research at the university. And it's not a real archive in the sense that archive tends to be a collection. I'm soliciting contributions that I'm now positioning as belongings, as a way to put those belongings back in relation with people, land capital L, stories, locations. And so strategies for that as a digital space lends itself a lot more open to things like video. We can hear a voice, we can see something moving. So it's already part of what's in my mind. And I think that comes from my own challenges around how do I talk about what I do, right? And how do I, as a performance, but then when it's in a gallery, when I'm not there, and then now the life beyond that, as a reference in the future, how does that exist? So those are some of the things I'm thinking about. Riel, what about?
Yeah, well, as Maria mentioned, I sort of have this, I feel like I was always sending you references like, oh, look at this one of different books that translate performance. I think recent examples are maybe Mirror, Echo, Tilt, published by Pacific. There was, I'm forgetting the artist's name, but there was a recent book of sort of performance transcriptions published by Primary Information. And then I think the book Speed of Resin by Dispersed Holdings also has this really beautiful way of translating a performance that took place in a space in their former location on the Bowery. and so I think part of the prompt, and I do have it handy, it was we asked everyone to contribute for their contributions to be the form of in the form of scores, prompts, text, image, essays, correspondences, documentation, depending on your approach and practice. So as Maria said, it was very open, and it was interesting to see what people just responded with. And I think some people who had worked in books with books before, either artist books or who contributed to books, had their own, maybe had something a little bit more intuitive and knew exactly how to approach the prompt. And with others, it was more of a collaboration just to decide, okay, how can we represent your project in this book and or your practice in this book? And one thing that I really loved, Maria, was that you were so flexible and encouraging of people who maybe were a little bit more hesitant to participate, and also very insistent and in a kind and caring way, and saying like, no, you have to be in this book.
People are very busy, right? So they're like, no. If they said no, I'd be like, but you're so important. I need you in the book. Or lots of things are happening in people's lives at that time, and still are, right? Yeah. So I know we're at 3, so I'm mindful of time. I know we have extra time, but I just wanted to flag that for anyone who's watching. We're gonna carry forth a little bit, if you want to stick around.
There is one more question here from Jason Lujan, I think to Maria. What are the highlights of your time with the Brooklyn performance scene, and what are the core differences in the performance communities in Canada now?
Oh my gosh. Well, so many highlights. I think the thing, like I often say that, or I think of it, I don't know if I said this, but I feel this, that I feel like trying to get emotional. I feel like I found my heart in Brooklyn through the performance art scene, because people there were performing out of just the need to. They wanted to. They had a burning desire. And I've also heard it said that for some people, it kept them alive, which feels dramatic, but it was that urgent that work be made. In a lot of cases, and people by any means possible in all kinds of humble modes did that. And that changed my thinking coming from Canada, where it was very much like a grant driven market where the performance had to be thought through. You had to have it all worked out, and then you applied for money, and then you did it, right? There was this big thing. And suddenly it was like, I could really put myself out there and try things with a community that we would see each other perform all the time. But then I'd be like, oh, Ayanna Evans is going to be there, and Zach Fabre's going to be there, and Ivy Castellanos, they're going to be watching. So I need to really deliver. Like, I can't let them down. I need to push myself. And so we were constantly performing for each other and with each other. And I realized in Canada, I didn't feel that was the case because of this insistence of scarcity, where there's only room for one Native artist. And it's a very superficial discussion. It never gets into the good stuff. And so I guess that's what I would, in returning to Canada and having that moment during the pandemic, what brought me to turn towards that. Like the Brooklyn performance community, they have a book that came out. They're doing it, right? There's Emergency Index. There's all kinds of stuff for them. But I realized that wasn't the case for the Indigenous performance artists. And that from even that list that you saw, there are so many, and there's many more. Even in looking at that, I can think of so many people who I'm like, oh yeah, I want to see them in there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, and maybe we didn't really talk about your exhibition protocol break at Patel Brown, and there are some maybe connections between breaking protocol and protocol break that I'm curious to hear. I don't know. I really love I love the press release for the exhibition.
Oh yeah,
it's like so.
I'd love to hear you talk about it because I did that after the fellowship. So yeah, yeah. What did you think? You experienced it online.
I mean, I wish I had been able to see it in person. It such a beautiful show, and it had all of these gorgeous felt pieces, and you see one of the felt pieces behind you, and then I think you were also going to show us some of the jingles that you used in your performance. Oh, right. Yeah. So yeah, it was. I really liked the framing around the show. That came out of the press release, and I'm forgetting the writer's name.
Oh, right, Sherry Boyle.
Yeah.
So, so it's a, an exhibition that happened after the pandemic at a commercial gallery here in Toronto. And when they really left it open for what I wanted to do. And it's interesting because the exhibition, there was no performance in the gallery there, so it's but a lot of the work was definitely like, there was a felt rotary phone that hung on the wall. There was a felt ukulele, a felt chair, photos of the felt chair in different, arrangement. So I think it did speak to all of this work that I've been doing. A beautiful self-portrait, lots of different stuff. But the framing of it was when they said, well, or I asked them, I want someone to write about the show as well that we can have alongside. And they're like, great, who would you like? And I thought about it, and in the end, I think my husband had mentioned, he's like, what about that artist Sherry Boyle? I'd seen her exhibition. She's a ceramicist artist. She's worked a lot with she's collaborated. She's a settler based in Toronto, but she's white, but she's worked a lot with different Native artists on projects. So I had met with her already, and I asked her to throw the idea out there, and she was like, of course. So this idea of having another artist, not a performance artist, but another artist who had a relationship to the gallery, write an essay. And she really stuck to the plate, really took it serious, and even created a few illustrations. And at the end of it, I'm like, Sherry, the illustrations would do, because the show's called Protocol Break, so the illustration could be the essay, right? I was really thinking outside the box, got super excited. I'm like, it doesn't have to be just an essay. Like, I really started, because I already began working on this project. So there's a felt room in that show, like
I really like the I like the breaking with the protocols of how an exhibition can look in a space, what information the viewer is given versus not given when they enter a space. I like the line, what is it? Gallery protocol, the exhibition breaks gallery protocol. It will be artist-led, community-fed, and the artists will do whatever the fuck they want. I think that's brilliant. I'm not embarrassing you. And maybe, I don't know, this could be the last question, or we could continue, but
I'll add to that exhibition. And so what often happens for performance artists is we'll often get in a residency the smallest studio, because apparently we don't need space, or we might not get an exhibition even if we make things. So it's like, how do you so for that exhibition at Patel Brown, just really wanting, for my own practice, I am a maker, and I'll show you what I made in a moment. Yes. And you can think about that question. So I have a pair of jingle pants that I made. while I was doing the fellowship that I wore during my performance with Jane Schoolcraft when I was singing. So it has a number of these jingles on it, which I often use in my work. So I'll share that with you. These are just a pair of tie about this is incredible pair of pants. All these jingles. So when you wear it, you know, I just remember making it and being like, do I need more jingles, Jason? And he was like, more jingles.
You always need more jingles.
So this idea that when you see a jingle, you think it's like a bell, but it doesn't have a hammer in it like a bell does. So it needs the other, it's just a curled like circle. It needs each other to make the sound. And the idea is your movement, how you carry yourself. It's a lot of references around the jingle, around that it's connected to the sound of water, creation, very anchored, and a lot of Anishinaabek ceremony and tradition as well. But I use it in my art, in my performances, and I've returned to using it. So just share some of my noisemakers.
Yeah,
so
yeah, that could also be the name of a band, Noisemakers. It's just but no, what I loved about the your performance, Supermassive Thunderboom Ultimate Collection, which I feel like I have to say in its entirety every time I say it because there's no other way.
I want all of it.
yeah. If I say Supermassive, like no, what? Keep going. Was the set list? It's it's these. And you also use the jingles in your performance with Electric Jen at Kara. And yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about the, kind of the sound of protest, but also sounds that have been co-opted by, the jingles themselves, but also rock music and punk and how it's this thing that was created and fed by BIPOC communities, EDPOC communities, and that it's been kind of co-opted and taken and turned into something else. And it's like, no, we want that back.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, how do you capture the sound of jingles in a book, right? So, I mean, I have made a thing, actually at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, there is a jingle dress made out of paper. And one of the things given the theme of this conference and what we're talking about, on each jingle, traditionally there's one jingle for each day of the year, but on the dress, I put the name of a Native American author, Canadian and United States of America author from a list that I found. So there are 500 on jingles on that. And one of the things that drove me crazy, of course, was that, and it was made to my scale, was that it just rustled, right? It just made the sound of paper. And that was an early work that then led to performance. But anyway, thinking of how do you translate some of that energy and intentionality and materiality into a book form through text, image,
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be.
That was really amazing. And I cannot wait for the book to come out. I think it's coming out next year. Is that right?
Yes. It's co-published by the Vera List Center and Inventory Press. So should see it at the New York Art Book Fair next year, hopefully.
Next year. Fabulous. This has been so great, Rial and Maria, and so great to hear your perspectives on performance, Indigenous art, and the book, and how they all sort of intersect. So fabulous. And this is going to be recorded, and it's going to be on the CABC website. And this evening, we actually have a keynote with Camila Janan Rashid at 7:30. So please drop into that. That's in person, but also live streamed. So thank you all. Thank you for your time and for your work and for this lively conversation.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.